Welcome back. We're going to look at the first step in week 4, which is to do a riskiest assumption test. Riskiest assumption test, also known as a RAT, is a very simple tool we use to check whether the data that we've collected or the things that we've written down in our issue tree, in our beneficiary personas, or in our ecosystem map, if they're really true. Because sometimes we have a confirmation bias, or sometimes we have a preconceived notion of what might be true, and we end up putting things in our issue tree or putting things in our persona or putting things in our ecosystem map that we haven't really fact checked, and that potentially we're even stereotyping to some degree. And it's good, just before we go into Diamond 2, to check if the information that we've collected, if it's really true. And to do that, we're going to do a riskiest assumption test. Now, a riskiest assumption test is made out of a few stages. In stage 1, you have to identify the riskiest assumptions. What are they? What are the things that you've maybe put into your issue tree or that you've written about your persona that may not be fully true, or that need to be tested further to check if they're actually true? That's step 1. So identifying the assumptions. Step 2 is to come up with what we call an experiment to test those assumptions. Now, an experiment is typically a form of field or desk research that we use to fact check ourselves. So depending on what your assumption is, you should conduct an experiment that's appropriate to prove that assumption true or false, right? Or to find new data about that assumption. And then in step 3, we analyze the results of that test, and we decide what changes need to be made to the information that we currently have in, for example, our issue tree or our persona. And those are the 3 main steps of the assumption test. So first, identify riskiest assumptions, then conduct an experiment to test that assumption, and then to see how that changes the results or the data that you've already collected. Now, the reason that conducting riskiest assumption tests is so important is it helps us to make sure that when we go into Diamond 2, when we start to ideate, right? When we start to think of solutions for the areas that we want to have a positive impact on, the assumption tests help us ensure that the potential projects that we come up with or the potential startup solutions that we come up with will actually be impactful, because the data that we've collected is correct and true. So they're very important. There's this saying, or there's this famous number actually right here. I don't know if some of you recognize it, but this is the number for how many startups typically fail. So 1 out of 10 startups typically fail. And one of the reasons that they fail is because they haven't understood something about their market well, or they haven't looked at the feasibility of their business idea well. And basically it comes down to not having really checked some of the assumptions before launching their idea. And we want to prevent that. And to help you prevent that, we're going to conduct these assumption tests. So the first step in the assumption test is to collect the riskiest assumptions you have. The way I want you to do that is quite simple. I want you to first look at your ecosystem. I want you to go to your ecosystem, open up all the data that you've collected, and together identify areas where you may have made an assumption. So, for example, maybe you wrote the part about your competitors really quickly, or maybe you wrote the part about the political aspects. Maybe there's something you wrote there, but you're not sure about it. Maybe you need to fact check it. Maybe you assume that there's a law, but you're not sure if that law is really true or what the details of that law are. Maybe you identified a problem maker, but maybe you need to dig a little bit deeper to find out a bit more about that problem maker to make sure that you've understood them correctly. So collect these different assumption areas. Just write them all down. Next, look at your persona. So here was an example of David Miller that I used last week. What did you collect about this persona, this beneficiary? And are there certain things that you may have stereotyped about? right? Or are there certain things that you assume to be true, but you've never really talked to that individual or that demographic to make sure that it's true or not? So again, critically look at what you've written down in that persona and write down wherever you may have made an assumption. And finally, and perhaps most crucially, is to look at your issue tree. Look at your issue tree extremely critically, because the issue tree is what you're going to use to go into Diamond 2. So the assumption testing, if you do it anywhere, do it in the issue tree especially. This is an issue tree from last week, right? We looked at the high number of bus accidents. This was an example that I showed. Now, let's just look through it. Look through every single cause and effect and every single branch and just think, where have I made an assumption? And list them down. So here, for example, on the bottom left-hand side, there's this kind of branched area around stress. And they talk about alcohol abuse and tight schedules and bad traffic situations. Are those things really true? And to what degree are they true? How much alcohol abuse really happens? Is it really an issue or not? How do I know it's an issue? Did I find some information? Is that information reliable? Does it really sketch a good example of what the reality of the situation is? Or is it a one-time thing that happened and now I'm suddenly plugging it into the issue tree as if it's always true? So look at that and collect these assumptions. So once you've collected all those assumptions, so you've collected assumptions about your issue tree, about your persona, and about your beneficiary, about your ecosystem map, collect them all. And as a group, decide which of these assumptions are really important to get an answer to in order for you to have a good understanding of how you can have an impact. Typically, some of the assumptions around your beneficiary are quite important, especially if they're big and you don't know specific things about your beneficiary. These can be very important. But other things can be important too, like if there's a certain law that's applicable right now or that's coming into play right now for you, or political movement that's important. Any of these things can be considered riskiest, and it's up to you as a group to decide which of the assumptions you've listed are riskiest going into Diamond 2. So make a selection of your top 10 riskiest assumptions that you think you need to check, you need to validate before going into Diamond 2. And once you've selected those 10, I want you to write them down. Write them down on the slides. And I want you to come up with a way that you can fact check them. It can be a simple desk research, so you could do some more reading, but I also encourage you to do some field research. Maybe get in touch with an organization in your local ecosystem to find out a bit more, get in touch with a beneficiary to find out a bit more. So try to do a good mix of field and desk research wherever you can. So then it's time to do the experiment. So you've listed your 10 riskiest assumptions, you've come up with an experiment to fact check them. Now go and conduct that research and collect that data. So write it down. What have you found out about this assumption? What have you found out about assumption 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10? Collect that data. And this is where the most crucial step occurs actually, is you have to come together as a group and look at that data and decide how it affects the content that you've already collected till date. So do you need to change something in your ecosystem map as a result of the data that you've collected? Is there something you need to tweak in your persona because of the content you've created? And perhaps also most importantly, within the causes and effects that you've listed in your issue tree, where do you need to make changes as a result of the data that you've collected? And once you've done that, you've basically done a riskiest assumption test, and you've done a quick version. Later on in Diamond 2 and 3, you will go into assumption testing on a deeper level by looking at minimal viable products. But for now, this gives you a nice intro into assumption testing. So get that done. And then when you're ready, move on to the next step, step 2, which is where we'll look at it, picking an intervention logic within your issue tree.